folks, in some of my recent YouTube videos I did on the Royal Canadian Artillery Museum at CFB Shiloh in Manitoba, the Calgary Military Museums, and the Alberta Aviation Museum in my hometown of Edmonton, I briefly mentioned nuclear weapons that were available should the need arise to the Canadian Air Force and Army in the late 1950s through to the early 1970s. These nukes were deployed in Europe and Canada using the Honest John missile system, the Bowman Missile, the CF-104 Starfighter, and the CF-101 Voodoo. And I thought these weapons rated a video of their own where I could go into more depth on what Canada possessed. Some of what I might discuss in this video might be wrong, and I would appreciate if any of my viewers detect an error in this video, if they would leave a comment below to let me know and what other viewers know where I fell short. As a kid in the 1960s and 70s, I was not aware Canada possessed nuclear weapons. But this was a period of great tension between the Soviet Eastern Bloc and the West, and Edmonton, due to its strategic location as the location of major oil refineries and military facilities, was considered a prime target for a nuclear strike. It was always at the back of my mind as a kid growing up that someday the USSR might launch nukes and blast away our safe and happy home. To heighten this awareness at the back of me and my family's minds, there were civil defense sirens located throughout Edmonton, including one located beside a traffic circle 2 blocks from my home. There were no bomb shelters or instructions on what to do should the Russians launch a nuclear war. So all this siren by my home did was scare the wits out of my poor mother in the late 1970s when the siren went off by mistake. While me and my sister were in school. She told me there was nothing I could do, there was nowhere I could go, I didn't have my children with me, should this be real and the nuclear bombs were on their way. Around 1990, this civil defense siren was taken down as it served no real purpose. The only civil defense fallout shelter that I know of in Edmonton is this one right over here, which is in the bank of the Mackenzie Ravine, just off of 142nd Street. This shelter was built in 1953 for the use of civil defense in Edmonton, to house fire, police, and important civic personnel, and the mayor of Edmonton for up to 2 weeks following a nuclear strike, to begin the task of reconstruction once it was safe to do so. As I film this YouTube video, unfortunately, the bunker is in a temporarily fenced-off construction yard for a sewer trestle rehab project that crosses the Mackenzie Ravine in this location. I was able to remain outside the fenced-off area and not trespass and still get a few photos of the shelter, and truth be said, there's not much to see above ground except a structure that could be mistaken for a maintenance shed. In 1977 or 78, my Army Cadet unit was taken inside this shelter to have a look. From what I remember, after entering the small building in a fenced-off area, we went down a very long stairway, about 10 to 20 stories down below street level, to an area the size of an average house in Edmonton that had cooking facilities, sleeping areas, office space, and a small library with paperback novels. A very small, claustrophobic area for up to 35 people to live for 2 weeks after a nuclear strike. Luckily, it was never had to be used for this purpose, and was permanently closed in the 1980s due to concerns over the air quality in this confined space. The appearance of nuclear weapons on Canadian soil came very shortly after World War II, at the very early stages of the Cold War with the Soviet East Bloc, when in the summer of 1950, at Goose Bay Labrador in the Canadian province of Newfoundland, the U.S. Air Force Strategic Air Command stationed between 11 and 15 Mark IV atomic bombs, along with 43 Boeing B-50 Super Fortress bombers used to carry them. The Mark IV was an updated design of the Mark III Fat Man bomb, one of which was dropped on the Japanese city of Nagasaki on the 9th of August, 1945. The second, and thank God, the last time a nuclear bomb was used in warfare. The Mark IV was in service with the American military from 1949 to 1953. These Fat Man bombs were an implosion device that used conventional explosives to compress uranium-238 and plutonium onto a polonium-beryllium initiator to start a runaway fission nuclear reaction, resulting in, depending on the setup, an explosion of between 1 to 31 kilotons of TNT, or in other words, an explosion of between 1,000 to 31,000 tons of TNT. These early nukes were delicate devices that could be easily damaged and required off-aircraft inspection each time the bomber landed. Goose Bay was set up so that the bombers could be refueled, the crews relieved, and the nuclear bombs offloaded and inspected in a dry, warm location while the bomber was on the ground. During this time period, 2 of these Mark IV Fat Man bombs were involved in broken arrow incidents. Broken arrow is the term the United States military uses to describe accidents involving nuclear weapons. The first broken arrow incident occurred on February the 13th, 1950, when a B-36 bomber flying from Alaska to Texas experienced major engine failures just off the coast of British Columbia near the town of Prince Rupert. The plane's mission was to practice arming the Mark IV Fat Man while in flight, using a lead ball as a substitute for the plutonium core, and then practice a bombing run over San Francisco before landing at its home base in Texas. Due to the extreme cold temperature of -40, the fuel carburetors froze, resulting in fuel dumping onto hot engine parts, resulting in a fire on 4 of the plane's 6 engines. The 16-man crew, plus 1 passenger, jettisoned the bomb before bailing out of the plane, which crashed into Mount Kolavjet. 5 of the men from this incident were presumed to have landed in the ocean after bailing out and died of hypothermia, and the remaining 12 were later rescued. The jettisoned Mark IV Fat Man nuke was never found, and the Canadian government was not informed that the crash bomber had been carrying a nuclear bomb. In 2016, a diver looking for sea cucumbers off of Pitt Island on the British Columbia coast saw an object that could have been the missing Fat Man bomb. The Canadian Navy investigated, and the object was confirmed not to be the missing nuke. And so, 73 years later, there is still a missing Fat Man bomb, presumably somewhere off the British Columbia coast. 1950 was not a banner year for the United States Air Force, for they managed to drop another Mark IV Fat Man nuke over Canada. This time over eastern Canada, over the St. Lawrence River near the town of Rivière-du-Loup in Quebec. This time a B-50 bomber that picked up a Mark IV Fat Man from the storage facility in Goose Bay was returning to its home base in Davis-Mohan Air Force Base in Arizona when it encountered engine trouble. U.S. Air Force regulations at the time forbade aircraft experiencing engine troubles to land with a nuke on board, and so the crew ejected the bomb at 10,500 feet over the St. Lawrence River after setting it self-destruct to detonate the bomb's conventional explosives at 2,500 feet. The plutonium core was not present in the Fat Man, so there was no danger of a nuclear detonation, but the explosion scattered 100 pounds of radioactive uranium-238 over the area. The bomber diverted to Loring Air Force Base in Maine and landed safely. The Mark IV Fat Man nukes left Goose Bay in December 1950 and returned to bases in the United States. The air base at Goose Bay then constructed a highly secure weapons storage area in 1954, which was upgraded in 1958 for the American Strategic Air Command to store nuclear weapons. The Goose Bay weapons storage area was the only weapons storage area in Canada constructed to house the Mark IV, AIM-26 Falcon, and Air 2 Genie nuclear weapons. The nuclear weapons storage area at Goose Bay was closed and the last nuclear weapons stored there removed in June 1971. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, a debate raged on what role Canada should play in nuclear deterrence. On one side were those who insisted that Canada needed to play a very active role and have access to nuclear weapons to keep itself safe from Soviet aggression. On the other side were those who opposed nuclear weapons of any sort, and especially in Canada. The Progressive Conservative government of John Diefenbaker found itself caught up in the middle of this debate when in 1960 it was revealed that the Bowman anti-aircraft missiles that the Canadian government had purchased needed nuclear warheads to be effective against the Soviet bomber force they were deployed to counter. The Conservative government flopped about, dithered, and tore itself apart about acquiring nuclear weapons or not. During the 1963 Cuban Missile Crisis, the Bowman missiles deployed in Canada were useless should the crisis have escalated to the point that they were needed to counter Soviet bombers coming from the Soviet Union, as they did not have the needed nuclear warheads to be effective. All this combined made the Conservative government look weak on defense, which in no small measure helped lead it to losing the 1963 election to the Liberal government of Lester B. Pearson. Lester B. Pearson's Liberal government, after winning the 1963 election, entered into a custodial agreement with the United States in regards to nuclear weapons. Under this agreement, Canada accepted nuclear weapons, but they remained the property of the United States and were maintained and stored in Canada and West Germany by custodial units of the United States Air Force, and in the case of the Honest John missile system, by custodial units of the United States Army. Under this agreement, Canada could join and have a say in policy planning regarding these weapons, and the nukes could be released to Canada for deployment in a time of crisis. Under this agreement, the following nuclear weapons became available to Canada should the need arise. 56 Bowman surface-to-air missiles with nuclear warheads deployed in Ontario and Quebec. 4 Honest John rocket systems with 4 rockets and 4 warheads each for a total of 16 nuclear warheads deployed in West Germany with Canada's NATO force, with another Honest John rocket system without the nuclear warheads deployed in Canada at CFB Shiloh for training. 108 nuclear W-25 Genie rockets carried by 54 CF-101 Voodoos. Between 90 to 210 tactical nuclear warheads assigned to 6 CF-104 starfighter squadrons, totaling about 90 aircraft based with NATO in Europe. We will now take a brief look at these weapon systems, starting with the Honest John rocket. During my July 2022 visit to the Royal Canadian Artillery Museum at CFB Shiloh in Manitoba, I saw the Honest John rocket display they had in their yard, which included the truck-mounted launcher, transport trailer, and 2 rockets. The Honest John was the first American nuclear-capable surface-to-surface rocket and was in service with the United States Army from 1953 to 1991. This rocket system was also widely used by various NATO allies, including Canada. The Honest John missile was in service with the Canadian Army from 1960 to 1970, with 2 surface-to-surface missile batteries. The first deployed in West Germany, and a second battery as a training unit at CFB Shiloh. The nuclear warheads for Canada's Honest Johns were only in West Germany and not Canada. The Honest John crew consisted of 13 men. The assembled rocket is just over 27 feet long and weighs 5,800 pounds. The rocket had a range of between 3.4 to 15.4 miles and could achieve a maximum speed of Mach 2.3 and a maximum service height of 30,000 feet. The nuclear warhead that could be fired from the Honest John had a yield between 2 to 30 kilotons. The Honest John could also mount conventional explosive and chemical warheads. Moving on, we will now take a look at the Genie air-to-air missile carried by the CF-101 Voodoo. The Genie Missile was the nuclear weapon available to Canada for the longest period, entering service in 1963 and leaving service in 1984, when the CF-101 Voodoo was replaced by the CF-18. The Genie was just over 9 feet long, weighed 822 pounds, and had an operational range of 6 miles at a speed of Mach 3.3. The nuclear warhead had a yield of 1.5 kilotons. The Genie missile was unguided once launched and would be shot into an enemy bomber formation where the massive nuclear explosion would take them out. On July 19, 1957, during Operation Plum Bob, 5 Air Force officers and their cameramen stood at ground zero under a 2-kiloton detonation of a Genie nuclear missile at 10,000 feet, as a publicity stunt to demonstrate that the Genie nuclear bomb could be used over civilian populations to take out enemy bombers. The men were unharmed and passed away between 1990 to 2014. This was the sole time that a Genie nuclear device was detonated. Time to move on to have a look at the Bowman Missile. To fulfill Canada's obligation to the NATO and NORAD agreements that was meant to have been accomplished by the cancelled Arrow project, the Diefenbaker government purchased 56 Bowman missiles to be deployed at La Mikaza, Quebec, and North Bay, Ontario. Bowman missiles were housed horizontally in hardened shelters. In the event that NORAD Command detected Soviet bombers en route to Canada and the United States, an order would be given to prepare the missiles for launch. To prepare a missile for launch, the top of the shelter opened and the Bowman missile was raised to the vertical position inside the shelter from where it could be launched. The Bowman was able to achieve a speed of Mach 2.8 at an altitude of 66,000 feet for a range of 250 miles. When in range of the Soviet bombers, a 10-kiloton nuclear fission warhead was detonated to take out the bombers. As the 1960s progressed, the threat shifted from Soviet bombers carrying nuclear bombs towards Soviet intercontinental missiles, a threat the Bowman missile system was ill-suited to counter. When Pierre Trudeau succeeded Lester Pearson as Prime Minister in 1968, his government announced that the Canadian forces would no longer be supplied with nuclear weapons to show Canada's support for the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. All American nuclear weapons stationed in Canada, including those for the Bowman missiles, were returned to the U.S. by 1972. The Bowman missiles were decommissioned and the bases and launch pads in Canada disassembled and sold as scrap metal. Finally, it is time to look at the CF-104 Starfighter and the nuclear weapons it could carry. Starting in 1963 and ending at the end of 1973, Canada maintained 6 nuclear strike squadrons in Europe using the CF-104 Starfighter. During this time period, there were CF-104s on alert at all times in secure, heavily guarded areas in Europe, armed with nuclear weapons ready to go on a moment's notice. Should the need ever have come up, the CF-104 nuclear strike squadrons would have been tasked with taking out Warsaw-Pact missile sites, headquarters, and airfields. To accomplish this mission, the CF-104s could be armed with a variety of nuclear bombs, including the B-28, B-43, and B-57. After its nuclear mission ended, the CF-104s switched to a reconnaissance and ground attack role until it was withdrawn from Canadian service in 1984 with the introduction of the CF-18 Hornet. As we have seen in this video, throughout the Cold War, Canada had a controversial and often non-transparent policy regarding nuclear weapons. Starting in the early 1970s and ending in 1984, Canada ended its deployment of these weapons and is among the first countries in the world to voluntarily give up nuclear weapons. Today, Canada belongs to various organizations and agreements to limit the proliferation of nuclear weapons, but is still protected by the nuclear forces of the United States. Canada still allows aircraft and ships of its American and NATO allies to use its airspace and ports when they are carrying nuclear weapons in accordance to its obligations to the NATO and NORAD treaties. Only the future will show if this non-nuclear weapon stance works out and makes us safe or just makes us an easy target for a nuclear aggressor. We can only hope for the best. Till we meet again, everyone keep safe and well.